I was a former forensic toxicologist. I spent my entire life searching for truth in analyses, stains, and test tubes. And now, my own daughter, a doctor I trusted completely, looked at me as if I were unwell. "The house is making you crazy, Dad," she said. What she didn't know was that a week before her visit, I had already scraped the walls myself, sealed the samples in containers, and brought them to the lab where I once taught. And when the results came back, everything fell into place, except for one thing: why she had done it. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Stanley. I was 81 years old, and I lived alone in the house I had bought with my wife 46 years ago. She passed away 7 years prior, and since then, the house had become both my shelter and my burden. I was a retired forensic toxicologist. I had spent 4 decades examining trace elements, chemical residues, and airborne toxins in sealed labs and courtrooms where men in suits argued over the weight of a molecule. Precision had been my currency. Now it was a habit I couldn't shed. The house sat on a quiet street in a suburb outside Rochester, New York. It had once been bright with laughter and footsteps. Now it groaned. I could hear it at night, wooden joints expanding with temperature drops, the low hum of pipes struggling to push water to the upstairs bathroom, the creak of the floorboards settling deeper into the earth like tired old bones. I sometimes wondered if it was aging with me, or simply reflecting my own decline back at me in the language of architecture. Every morning followed the same ritual. I would wake up before dawn, not from an alarm, but from the insistent pain in my hips. I would sit up slowly, gripping the bed frame with both hands, and swing my feet down onto the cold oak floor. The chill always shocked my soles. I kept wool slippers beside the bed, but the cold found its way through anyway. Then I would shuffle to the bathroom, where the tiles were colder still. The faucet hissed when I turned it, and I waited for the water to run warm before rinsing my face. The mirror above the sink showed a face that was no longer mine. It was a pale mask carved by time, eyes sunken, jaw slack, but the stare, yes, the stare still had precision in it. Downstairs, the kitchen welcomed me with the scent of dust and leftover coffee. I no longer made full breakfasts, a slice of toast sometimes, or oatmeal if I had the strength to stir the pot long enough. The cabinets had warped with time, and one of the drawers near the stove stuck stubbornly whenever I tried to open it. I no longer tried to fix things, not because I couldn't, but because I had begun to feel as though the house resisted my interventions, as though it had decided its own pace of deterioration and resented interference. I first noticed something was wrong on a Wednesday. It had rained the night before, a long, heavy downpour that soaked through the ground and left the neighborhood shrouded in mist. The air inside the house felt damp when I woke. Not just humid, wet. The kind of wetness that clings to skin and clothes, that seeps into your lungs. My sheets were clammy, and my breath came out in short, rasping clouds. I coughed into my palm and saw nothing but felt something sharp and dry in the center of my chest. A splinter of ache. I blamed the weather. Old houses absorb rain like lungs fill with smoke. I went downstairs and opened the windows for air, but it only let more dampness in. The walls around the window frames were beginning to bubble. Not visibly, not enough to raise alarm, but I saw it. The faintest ripple beneath the paint. The drywall was sweating. That day, I sat in my study longer than usual. The books on the shelves still carried the scent of ink and paper, but the air in the room had changed. It smelled. How to describe it? Like earth, but rotted. Like leaves sealed in a plastic bag for too long. Fungal. I leaned closer to the vent near the floor and inhaled. There it was. The unmistakable trace of mycelium. A memory stirred. I had once testified in a case involving a housing complex in Syracuse, where black mold had grown behind the walls for years. Children had developed respiratory issues. An old man, not unlike myself, had hallucinated voices. He had died before the cleanup began. That night, my dreams were chaotic. Not nightmares exactly, but fragmentary sequences that made no sense. Images of staircases folding inward, a door closing repeatedly without sound, my late wife standing in the hallway and shaking her head as though I had forgotten something vital. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me like seaweed. My heart was pounding. I sat up, gripping my chest, and waited until the thudding slowed. The next morning, I walked to the pantry and stood still for a long moment. The door was ajar. I never left it open. Inside, the lower shelves had a faint discoloration at the back, just above the floor trim. I pressed my fingers to the wall. It was soft, not crumbling, not wet, but yielding, like paper soaked in milk. I pulled my hand back and rubbed my thumb against my forefinger. A faint grayish residue came off. I turned away and stood in the center of the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The floor beneath my slippers felt colder than usual. The air felt heavier. My joints ached, but differently now, not just with age, but with pressure, as if the atmosphere in the house had thickened. My breath came short again. I opened a window. The outside air felt sharp and dry against my face. I sat at the kitchen table, opened a notebook, and began to write. I noted the date, time, symptoms, and observations. Old habits, controlled environment, variables, external factors. I listed the weather conditions. I drew a diagram of the wall in the pantry and circled the soft spot. Then I flipped the page and sat there staring at the blank lines. That was when I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The house was making me sick. Or maybe it was something inside the house. Not an intruder, not a ghost. Nothing cinematic. Just time, moisture, neglect, and biology. The kind that blooms in shadows and eats through drywall. I had spent my career identifying poisons too small to see. I could feel one growing around me now, like an invisible fog curling in the corners of my life. By the time the sun rose fully, I had sealed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside my medications. I made tea instead of coffee. I washed the cup twice before I used it. And as I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, I watched the light struggle to enter through the dirty glass, diffused and pale. The house was silent, but not still. It was breathing. I could hear it. And I listened, like I had once listened in courtrooms and labs, waiting for something that would finally make sense. My daughter arrived on a Saturday morning, unannounced, as she often did. I heard the tires crackle over the gravel driveway and watched from the upstairs window as she stepped out of her car. She was wearing her usual beige coat and carried her tote bag slung over one shoulder, like a nurse rushing between patients. Her movements were quick and efficient, not hurried, but practiced. Like everything she did followed an internal checklist I had long ago stopped trying to read. She didn't ring the bell. She used her own key, the one I had given her years ago during my first hospital stay, when she insisted that emergencies demanded access. At the time, it had made sense. Now it felt like a quiet violation. The sound of the key turning was like a scalpel unwrapping sterile gauze. Clean, cold, uninvited. I came down the stairs slowly, each step stiff with the dull pain that had become my constant companion. She was already in the kitchen when I reached the bottom, rummaging through the refrigerator. Her back was straight, shoulders tense, and she made little noises, half sighs, half murmurs, as she inspected the contents. Bottles were lifted and replaced. Jars were unscrewed and sniffed. The milk was poured into the sink without a word. I stood in the doorway and watched her manage my life. She turned to the counter and laid out items from her bag. A new multivitamin bottle, a plastic pill organizer divided into days of the week, a stack of medical pamphlets, and a bright green folder. She opened it and flipped through pages with her thumb, then placed it beside the toaster like a menu waiting to be read. After a quick look around, she opened the cabinet above the sink, pulled out a chipped ceramic mug I'd used every morning for the last decade, and dropped it in the trash. I said nothing. I walked past her to the table, sat down slowly, and folded my hands over the tablecloth. It had a small stain from where I'd spilled coffee 2 days ago. She noticed it and frowned. She didn't speak, but her expression did the work. She cleaned in short, sharp motions, spraying the counter with a citrus-scented solution that made the room smell sterile, like an urgent care clinic. She wiped vigorously, as if the act of scrubbing could erase not just the grime, but the years embedded in the surface. The house seemed to tighten around her presence. The soft murmurs of wood and wind vanished beneath the sound of sanitized control. She opened windows for fresh air and winced when the hinges groaned. She sprayed the windowsills. She opened my medicine drawer and rearranged everything. She asked questions I didn't answer, not with words. I gave her nods, gestures, the same gestures she once used as a teenager when I asked how her school day went. The symmetry didn't escape me. She checked the thermostat and adjusted it downward. She said it was too warm in the house. I shivered slightly but said nothing. She brought out her phone and began scrolling, occasionally looking up at me with that clinical concern that physicians wear like a stethoscope around the neck. Her tone was flat, measured, the tone of someone who had made a diagnosis before the patient even described the symptoms. She mentioned something about the mind, about how aging can lead to fixations. She talked about environmental paranoia, about delusions rooted in isolation. She brought up a study she had read about elderly patients becoming obsessed with mold and toxins. She said the internet was dangerous for people my age. I didn't respond. I listened to her voice as though it were a ceiling fan whirring overhead. Constant, impersonal, necessary, but never warm. She handed me a printed article, highlighting parts in yellow. Cognitive changes and environmental hypervigilance in the elderly, it read. The words were crisp and clean, like the lab reports I used to analyze. I held the paper in my hand, the corners already softening from the moisture in the air. I folded it neatly and placed it on the table. Then she brought out a blood pressure cuff and wrapped it around my arm. She wrote down the numbers. She looked at my fingernails. She examined the skin on my neck. She tilted my head gently, clinically, like I was a cadaver to be assessed. She asked about my sleep, my appetite, my bowel movements. The questions came fast, like bullets. I offered brief, guarded answers, not because I had something to hide, but because I knew she wasn't asking to know me. She was asking to confirm something. She opened the green folder again and showed me a chart, diet recommendations, a medication schedule, hydration tracking. She had printed out a daily planner with time slots. 8 house, wake, 8:30, breakfast, 9 house, walk, 10 house, water, 1 cup. She had filled in every hour until bedtime. I looked at it, not as a plan, but as a verdict. There was no space for thought, no space for stillness. Before she left, she cleaned out the pantry. She checked expiration dates and tossed half the contents. She stood on a chair to inspect the top shelves. When she climbed down, she brushed her palms together as if dusting off my independence. At the door, she reminded me to call if anything felt strange. She told me not to read too much online. She said she loved me and that I was lucky to have someone looking out for me. I nodded. I watched her walk to the car and pull away, tires leaving faint marks on the wet gravel. When the house fell silent again, it felt like a vacuum had been released. I sat back down at the kitchen table and looked at the green folder. I flipped through the pages slowly. The chart, the vitamin guide, the memory games. It was all tidy, all logical, all impersonal, care packaged like a prescription. I opened the trash and took out my chipped ceramic mug. It wasn't broken, just stained. I washed it by hand, slowly, and placed it back on its hook. The house seemed to exhale, just a little. That night, I noticed the cough return, just a little rasp at the back of my throat. The ceiling fan made a faint click as it turned. The windows stayed open longer than they should have. The air was colder. The blanket didn't seem to help. As I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the paint looked like veins. I tried to sleep, but beneath the layers of care, beneath the planner and the pills, I felt something unfamiliar, not sickness, but suspicion, not of the house, but of the hands that had just arranged my life into clean little boxes. I closed my eyes and listened. The house wasn't quiet. It was waiting. And now, so was I. I spent the next 3 days in silence. I didn't turn on the television. I ignored the phone when it rang. I kept the lights off longer than usual in the morning and let the dim gray light from the windows guide my steps. There was something about silence that sharpened the senses. The kind of silence I used to crave in the lab, when the only sound was the low hum of the centrifuge or the faint tap of a pipette against glass. Silence meant clarity, focus, and I needed that now more than ever. The cough hadn't gone away. It came in short bursts, dry, sharp, unproductive. It scraped at the back of my throat like sandpaper and left a metallic taste that lingered for hours. I tried switching out the bedding, washing the curtains, vacuuming the vents, but nothing helped. The house felt denser, heavier, as if the walls themselves were exhaling something into the air, something I couldn't see, but could feel with every breath. On the 4th morning, I made the decision. It wasn't dramatic. It came quietly, like the slow ticking of a wall clock reaching the hour. I went to the back of the garage, where I kept the old metal toolbox. It was rusted at the hinges and coated with dust, but when I opened it, the inside was pristine. I had packed it myself years ago when I retired. Samples, swabs, slides, latex gloves, glass containers with screw-top lids, a portable field microscope. Most of it outdated by modern standards, but the principles hadn't changed. Truth didn't go stale. I put on gloves and moved through the house like a ghost. I began with the pantry, kneeling beside the soft spot I had noticed earlier. I took a sterile scalpel and scraped a sample from the bubbled drywall, carefully, deliberately, avoiding contamination. The fragment flaked off into the dish like ash. I took another from the baseboard near the floor. Then I moved to the bathroom, the corners of the ceiling, the rim of the vent above the shower. My fingers trembled slightly, but my hands remembered the work. Muscle memory returned like a familiar scent. I worked in silence for over 2 hours. When I removed the final glove, a faint smear of gray remained on the tip of my thumb. I stared at it for a long time. It reminded me of the dust we used to collect from crime scenes, innocent looking, but laced with deadly truths. I wiped it onto a cotton pad and sealed it with tape. I cataloged each sample in my notebook: location, appearance, consistency. I used coded tags to avoid confusion. On the last page, I drew a quick diagram of the house, marking each spot where a sample had been taken. The pattern was clear. The highest concentrations were in the lower levels: kitchen, basement pantry, bathroom. The moisture levels in those rooms had always been higher. Poor ventilation, condensation, a breeding ground. By mid-afternoon, I had packed everything into a plain cardboard box and sealed it with duct tape. I wrote my name on the top, along with the address of an old colleague, Dr. Edward Zimmer, a tenured professor at the state college across town. He had taken over the environmental pathology lab after I left. We hadn't spoken in years, but he was the kind of man who still respected the chain of evidence. I knew he wouldn't ask questions. Not yet. I drove the box to the courier station in town, I wore a mask, not because of the samples, but because my breath had started to catch in my chest, as if the air outside no longer felt entirely safe. The man behind the counter weighed the box and asked if it contained hazardous materials. I shook my head and said, "Research samples," in the same tone I had used for decades. He didn't press. Back at the house, I sat in the living room and waited. The fireplace was cold. The floor beneath my slippers felt damp, though I hadn't spilled anything. I could feel it now, whatever it was, spreading. Not like a monster, not even like a disease, like a presence, invisible but persistent. The gray powder on my thumb had left a smell in my nostrils, something between damp wood and old paper. I couldn't shake it. That night, I woke, gasping. My chest felt tight, like a belt cinched too hard around my ribs. I sat up slowly, coughing into the crook of my arm. I could taste something bitter, something chemical. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room. The walls looked darker in the corners, not shadowed, stained. I knew it was probably just my eyes playing tricks, but I also knew that doubt was the first layer mold spread through. Doubt and time. The following morning, I received the confirmation of delivery from the lab. The samples were in. I knew the testing would take 48 hours at the earliest. I spent the waiting hours documenting everything. The temperature readings, the behavior of my symptoms, the changes in the air. I began taping clear plastic sheets over certain vents, marking which rooms triggered coughing fits. I moved my sleeping area to the living room and began boiling water daily to increase air turnover. I limited my exposure to the kitchen and bathroom. It became a kind of quarantine. On the third day, I opened a cabinet I hadn't used in years, behind the old coats in the hallway. The back panel was warped. I touched it, and it crumbled slightly under my fingers, leaving behind a soft, silvery film. Not black, not green, just gray, indistinct, fuzzy, and silent. It was the silence that terrified me most. Not a hiss, not a smell strong enough to trigger alarm. Just presence. I scraped the residue into a slide and placed it under the microscope. The old lens still worked. What I saw was familiar. Spores. Chain-like, translucent. A memory rose unbidden from decades past. A case in Albany, a daycare center, infants with unexplained seizures. The culprit had been invisible, until I looked through the lens. I didn't wait for the official results. I already knew. My body knew. The headaches, the fatigue, the wheezing that came and went like a tide, the subtle erosion of clarity and thought, the fuzziness in the morning. It wasn't age. It wasn't anxiety. It was biology. I recorded everything in the notebook. Every cough, every spike of dizziness, every shift in the texture of the air. I marked the day and time I first noticed the symptoms. I traced them backward, through memory and observation. The timeline aligned too closely with the beginning of the rains 2 weeks prior, but also with something else, my daughter's first visit in months. I didn't want to draw conclusions without proof. That was something I had trained myself against, but suspicion settled into my bones like cold. Not fear, just awareness, a professional alertness. I opened the windows even though it was cold. I set bowls of vinegar in each room. I began boiling cloves and citrus peels, not for scent, but for the old folk belief that it cleared toxins. I didn't know if it worked, but I knew that control, even symbolic, mattered more than comfort. 2 nights later, the report arrived. I printed it immediately. 4 species of mold, 2 with known neurotoxic properties, 1 listed on the CDC database as hazardous under prolonged exposure. The levels were elevated in all samples and critical in 3. That word, critical, stood out like a siren in the report. I placed the report beside the microscope and stared at it for a long time. I felt no vindication, no relief, only a quiet confirmation that I had not imagined this. that the walls around me were not sick. They were making me sick. And whatever was growing in them was not just spores, but questions. And I was ready to answer them. The house had always creaked, but after I received the lab report, the sounds began to feel different, less like the settling of old wood, and more like warnings. I became hyper-aware of every shift in the floorboards, every sigh through the vents, every vibration from the baseboards. My ears had long grown used to silence, to the ambient hum of solitude. But now that silence was interrupted by a constant low-level tension. It wasn't just sound, it was sensation, a pressure in the walls, a presence. I kept the lab report hidden, not in a drawer, not in the folder my daughter had given me, but inside a hollowed-out copy of The Interpretation of Dreams that sat unnoticed on the shelf behind my desk. The spine was cracked and dusty, and no one had opened it in decades. I folded the pages carefully and tucked the report inside. I knew better than to assume information was safe simply because it was true. Truth required protection. I'd spent a career watching facts manipulated, delayed, misread. Sometimes, especially in families, truth was the first thing people tried to erase. 3 days after the report arrived, I began to notice small things out of place. They were so subtle at first, I thought perhaps I was being paranoid, or that my memory was slipping in ways I hadn't yet admitted to myself. A chair slightly angled away from the table, a spoon resting in the sink that I hadn't used. The box of crackers moved to the wrong shelf, all dismissible on their own. But together they formed a pattern. Someone had been in the house. I didn't have proof. Not yet. But that old feeling, the one I hadn't needed in years, came creeping back in. It was the same instinct I'd followed in courtrooms, in labs, during testimony. The awareness that something didn't add up, even if the math seemed fine on paper. A fracture forming beneath the surface. I began to pay closer attention. I cleaned the house meticulously, not out of compulsion, but to create a control environment. I set small paper markers beneath objects, a book on the coffee table, a salt shaker on the windowsill, a shoebox under the hallway bench, all positioned just so, aligned to the grain of the wood or the edge of a rug. Any movement would be obvious. Any touch, any disruption, would leave a trace. On the 4th night, I woke up and sensed the difference immediately. The air was colder than usual, not just in temperature, but in tone. It had that slight metallic sharpness that usually precedes a storm. I sat up and felt a tickle in my throat, a faint cough, dry, but persistent. I walked into the kitchen and stopped short. The window above the sink was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to shift the temperature, enough to explain the change in air pressure. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even been in the kitchen that evening. I approached slowly and examined the sill. No marks, no prints, but the latch had been turned, not forced, not broken, just opened. I closed the window, turned the lock, and stood still for a long time, my breath visible in the faint glow of the stovetop clock. My thoughts circled back to the signs I had ignored. The displaced chair, the spoon, the misplaced crackers, and now the window. I was not alone in this house, not entirely. The next morning I checked the attic door. It was undisturbed. The basement lock still rusted shut. I reviewed the perimeter from every window. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the garden soil. But the feeling remained. That afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf in the living room, I noticed the interpretation of dreams was not aligned the way I had left it. It tilted ever so slightly forward, its bottom edge flush with the shelf's lip. I pulled it down. The lab report was still inside, the pages untouched, but the dust pattern was wrong. The smear along the top of the spine, fresh. Someone had touched it, maybe even read it. I carried the book back upstairs and relocated the report to a safer place. I had a wooden box beneath my bed, a gift from my wife, lined with velvet and once used for keepsakes. I placed the report there, beneath old photographs and a small cloth bag that held my wedding ring. I locked the box with the tiny brass key and slipped it into my pajama pocket. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, my daughter called. Her voice was brisk, cheerful, overly cheerful. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I felt the same. She offered to bring soup. I declined. She asked if I had opened the pamphlets she had left. I told her I had. She reminded me to take the vitamins. I said I would. She told me I sounded tired. After the call, I sat by the window and stared at the garden. The earth was damp from last night's rain. I watched two squirrels chase each other across the fence. The sun moved slowly across the kitchen floor, casting long bars of light across the wood. I closed my eyes and thought about the way people smile when they're lying. Not the full kind of smile that creases the eyes, but the shallow one. The kind you wear when you need someone to believe you're safe or sane. In the days that followed, I found other signs. The trash can emptied when I hadn't touched it. A light bulb in the hallway replaced, though I hadn't climbed a ladder in months. The bathroom mirror wiped clean of the usual streaks, though I hadn't cleaned it. Each act small, each one deniable, but the sum of them undeniable. I began to carry the key to the wooden box with me at all times. I tied it to a string and wore it under my shirt. I installed a new deadbolt on the side door, the one no one used. I set a glass of water on the hallway table at night and measured the level in the morning. Once, it had dropped by half an inch. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. Not yet. But the first cracks had formed. Not in the walls, in the fabric of trust, in the sense of what was mine, what was safe. And once cracks begin, they spread. No matter how thick the paint, no matter how tightly you close the window, no matter how much you love the person holding the sponge. It came back to me in fragments, like a scent on the wind, faint, elusive, but unmistakable. The way certain memories live not in words or photographs, but in the body, in the nerves, in the instincts honed by repetition over decades. The trigger was subtle, a patch of discoloration beneath the radiator in the hallway, just a water stain perhaps, shaped like a spreading bruise across the baseboard. But the moment I saw it, I didn't think of water or age. I thought of mold, not the word, but the presence. And with that thought, the memory returned like a cold hand gripping my shoulder. It was late 1978 when the court first called me to testify on the Jefferson case. I had been working in the forensic pathology division for 5 years at that point, mostly tucked behind microscopes and chemical analyzers, far from the drama of trial rooms. But that case was different. A woman in her 70s had died in a senior housing unit just outside Buffalo. Her death was originally ruled natural, heart failure brought on by age and isolation. The facility claimed she was senile, hallucinating, probably not even aware of her surroundings in the final weeks. But something about the autopsy disturbed the young coroner. So, samples were sent to us. I remembered walking into the lab that morning. It was raining then, too. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular tone they reserve for damp days. I opened the file and found notes that mentioned lesions in the lungs, unusual for someone with no history of smoking, no chronic conditions. Her blood tests showed a high concentration of mycotoxins. That was rare, very rare, but not impossible. When I visited the apartment to collect environmental samples, the moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. It smelled, not bad, exactly, but wrong. Like wet books, like earth packed into a tight, airless space. The kind of smell that doesn't come from a single spill or a leaky pipe. It was systemic, saturated. The wallpaper near the ceiling was curling downward in slow waves. The corners of the room had shadows that didn't shift with light. I walked through in gloves and booties, collecting fragments of drywall, scraping powdery black residues from vents, peeling back a square of linoleum in the kitchen to reveal soft wood beneath. I processed it all myself. I didn't trust the junior techs to understand what they were seeing. Under the microscope, it looked like a forest, spores like spores always are, beautiful in structure, deadly in proximity. We found at least 3 strains capable of producing hallucinogenic effects, respiratory distress, and neurological degeneration. The woman hadn't been senile. She had been poisoned slowly, day after day, by the very air she breathed. And no one had believed her. I remembered standing in court, holding up the slide photo with the spore clusters in full bloom, and watching the jury shift in their seats. I explained how invisible things can kill, how air, when compromised, becomes a weapon. The defense argued we couldn't prove duration, exposure levels, or direct causality. But I had something better than absolute certainty. I had the smell. I had the residue beneath my fingernails. I had a record of every room I had walked through, every surface that flaked beneath my touch. That testimony led to a settlement. Millions paid in silence. The housing company rebranded. The apartment was renovated. But I never forgot the look on the woman's daughter's face when I told her the truth. She hadn't imagined her mother's decline. It wasn't age. It wasn't madness. It was neglect. And it left a mark not just on the lungs, but on the dignity of the person who passed. Years passed, and dozens of other cases faded in and out of memory. But that one stuck. Not because it was the worst, because it was the first time I understood the weight of being disbelieved. And now, sitting in my own home, I smelled it again. Fainter, less aggressive, but the same notes were there. The sweetness of decay masked by drywall, the sour breath of moisture in dark corners, the delicate fingerprint of something alive where nothing should be. I found myself walking the house as I had walked that apartment. Same steps, same pauses. I touched the walls with the back of my hand, feeling for warmth or softness. I crouched near vents and inhaled slowly, looking for that trace of fermentation. I tapped along the trim with the back of a spoon, listening for hollow shifts that betrayed rot. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't paranoia. It was process, a muscle memory of investigation. In the basement, the concrete floor was stained in places I hadn't noticed before. Not dark, not dramatic, just faint, irregular shapes that told of slow, invisible leaks. The smell there was stronger, denser. I stood in the center of the floor with my eyes closed and let the air settle on my tongue. Metallic, moldy, and beneath that, something newer, chemical, not the natural musk of time, but the artificial tang of solvents or sprays. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step bringing with it the sensation of retreat. The house felt like a puzzle, not just of age and moisture, but of intention, of intrusion. The memory of that first case gnawed at me, not because of what happened, but because I had seen it before the world believed it. Just like now. Back upstairs, I opened an old file drawer and pulled out the Jefferson photos. I kept them all these years, labeled and sealed. I laid them out on the table beside the current samples from my home. The patterns weren't identical, but they rhymed. The staining on the baseboards, the air vent discolorations, the residue clusters. My hands trembled slightly as I held the photos side by side. It wasn't just the past returning. It was the realization that I had allowed myself to become the kind of victim I had once sworn to defend. Quiet, reasonable, dismissed. I stood and walked to the window. The light outside was fading. The sun dipped behind gray clouds, and a new rain began to fall. It struck the roof with a soft hiss, the kind of sound that once soothed me. Now it made my jaw clench. Moisture was not innocent. Not here. Not anymore. And as the rain fell and the scent deepened in the corners of the room, I let the memory settle fully into my bones. The woman in Buffalo. her empty apartment, the invisible things that had killed her. I wasn't just remembering. I was returning. And this time, the case was personal. I began writing the letter just after dawn, when the light was soft enough not to glare on the page and the house was still, as if it too hadn't yet remembered to groan. I sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a flannel robe, hands curled around a lukewarm cup of tea I didn't drink. The pen felt heavy in my fingers, not because I lacked strength, but because the weight of knowing exactly what needed to be said made it difficult to begin. There was no recipient, no Dearsor at the top, just the page, just the quiet. I started with the facts, not feelings. Facts always came easier. I wrote down the symptoms, the cough that wouldn't leave, the fogginess in my head, the sudden exhaustion in the middle of the day. I described the shifts in the house, the smell in the vents, the way the walls seemed to sweat even in dry weather, the taste in the air that wasn't quite metallic, but wasn't right either. I detailed the moments of uncertainty, the way my body no longer felt like my own, the way my mind reached for clarity and sometimes returned empty-handed. I listed the dates when the symptoms began. I drew a timeline, noting my daughter's visits, the first signs of water damage, the arrival of the cough, the worsening of the insomnia. I marked the day I first scraped samples from the wall, the day I mailed them, the day the report arrived. I included the names of the molds, their classifications, their known health effects. I underlined neurotoxic and respiratory degeneration. I wrote slowly, pressing the pen into the paper until the words left faint indentations on the page behind. I didn't know who the letter was for. Maybe no one. Maybe the version of me who might not be able to speak later. Or maybe for the person who would find it when I was no longer capable of standing up and pointing to the truth. Writing it made it real, made it documented. It gave shape to what I feared would be dismissed as delusion. I had seen enough courtrooms to know that without records, without timestamps, without cold ink on the page, the truth could be drowned in doubt. After I finished the first letter, I wrote another. The second had fewer facts and more questions. I asked why. I asked how long. I asked what made care turn into something else, into management, into containment. I described my daughter's visits, her words, her tone, the way she looked at me not with love, but with assessment. I questioned whether it had started as concern and mutated into something more strategic, something with motives I hadn't wanted to see. I folded both letters and sealed them in separate envelopes. No names, just dates in the top right corner. I took them to my study and tucked one inside the bookcase behind a row of old textbooks, pressing it between forensic chemistry and principles of toxicology. The other I placed under the lining of the drawer in my nightstand, beneath a yellowing envelope of my wife's old letters. Later that morning, I began copying portions of the lab report by hand. I knew printed paper could be discarded quickly, but something handwritten always felt more human, less easy to dismiss. I transcribed the findings word for word, the species of mold, the spore counts, the levels deemed hazardous. I didn't embellish. I didn't comment. Just facts, lined up in ink like a quiet army standing at attention. I started storing these copies in strange places. One behind the fridge, taped to the wall where no one would look. One inside the empty casing of a broken smoke detector. One inside a hollowed-out VHS tape labeled Christmas '91 that I hadn't watched in years. I became methodical. Not paranoid. Methodical. Like I had during the investigations, when I'd hide control samples from the rest of the team to check for contamination. Redundancy wasn't obsession. It was insurance. Some nights I lay awake and composed full paragraphs in my mind. I recited the facts again and again, as if trying to engrave them on the inside of my skull. I imagined waking up one morning unable to remember why I was coughing, I imagined a voice telling me the symptoms were age, imagination, grief. I imagined that voice sounding like my daughter's, calm, clinical, convincing. So I wrote. I wrote about the night I found the gray residue behind the radiator. I described the pattern of discoloration and how it matched the photos from the Jefferson case. I wrote about the similarities between the way my lungs now burned and the complaints of the woman in Buffalo, how her family had thought she was exaggerating until she wasn't. I added footnotes, references, the names of studies I remembered, page numbers, old journals I once edited. My handwriting began to tilt slightly as the days passed, but I pressed harder to keep the lines straight. I wasn't just writing letters anymore. I was building a case, quietly, patiently, without alerting anyone. I started using my old portable cassette recorder, just a small dusty device with batteries that still worked. I dictated thoughts aloud at night, whispering into the tiny mic about changes in the house, changes in my body, moments that felt off. I labeled each tape with a date and a phrase. Hallway vent reading, January 11th. Basement scent, January 13th. Cough log, 5 incidents. I kept them in an old shoebox in the coat closet, beneath the lining, next to a flashlight and a box of spare bulbs. Each item had its place. Each item had its reason. And then came the letter I didn't want to write. It started the same way. Date, time, location. But then I wrote about my daughter directly. I wrote her name. I described her manner, her access to the house, her background in medicine, her recent financial stresses, information she had mentioned in passing, never thinking I'd remember. I listed the visits, the things that changed after them, the things that went missing. I described the insurance folder I had found, the policy I hadn't signed, the forged signature. I didn't accuse her outright. I stated observations. I let them sit beside each other like stones in a riverbed. The current of implication was quiet, but strong. Anyone reading the letter would feel it. I folded this one last. I sealed it with tape and placed it inside a small plastic bag, the kind we used for evidence samples. I labeled it, "In case of incapacitation." I placed it behind the false back of the cabinet in the dining room, where the drawers didn't quite align. I had carved the space out myself in the 1980s to hide a bottle of whiskey during my dry years. I hadn't used it since. The act of hiding the letter left me both relieved and hollow. I stared at the cabinet for a long time, one hand still resting on the wood. The house was quiet. The smell of moisture lingered faintly in the air, as if the walls had been listening. I went to bed that night knowing something had shifted, not outside, inside me. I was no longer simply documenting symptoms. I was documenting a crime, not a dramatic one, not one with fingerprints or broken windows, but the kind that seeps in slowly, disguised as love, the kind you have to prove before it erases you. So I kept writing, not because I expected someone to read it now, but because one day, someone might. And when they did, I wanted them to know that I had seen it, that I had known, that even in silence, I had left a trail. It began with the hallway bulb, the small ceiling-mounted fixture that had burned steadily for years, casting a warm yellow glow over the creaky floorboards and wallpaper that had faded to the color of old linen. I had replaced that bulb myself a decade earlier, and it had outlived its expected years of service with a kind of quiet loyalty. But one morning, as I shuffled down the hallway to retrieve the mail that never arrived early, I noticed the light was out. It wasn't a dramatic loss. There was no pop, no flicker, no burnt smell. It simply wasn't there. The air felt colder, the shadows longer. I stood beneath the fixture and stared up at the glass dome, then reached up with my palm and felt the chill of it. Still intact. No crack, no heat, just dark. I made a mental note to replace it later, but something stopped me. a kind of internal hesitation, as though the absence of that one light meant more than a dead bulb. That afternoon, I sat in my study and tried to read, but the page was dim, even with the desk lamp turned on. The bulbs, it seemed, were dimmer than I remembered. I replaced one with a fresh pack from the cabinet, still dim, a washed-out circle of light, weak and watery. That night, the bathroom mirror failed to fog. It was a detail I would have missed if not for the way light refracted differently off the glass. The overhead bulb buzzed faintly and then steadied, but the color was wrong. Pale, almost blue. I cupped my hands over my eyes and leaned closer to the mirror. My face looked unfamiliar, not older, but faded, like an overexposed photograph. I stood there for a long time, watching my own features blur into the dimness. Over the next few days, other lights followed. The kitchen ceiling light began to stutter when turned on, then held steady at half its normal brightness. The lamp by my bed, which I used every evening before sleep, started to cast an odd ringed pattern against the wall, as though something inside the bulb had warped. I tested outlets. I checked breakers. All normal. Then came the blackout in the dining room. I had just sat down with a bowl of soup, lukewarm, oversalted, and the overhead fixture gave a final buzz and died completely. I looked up, startled, spoon suspended mid-air. The room fell into a thick shade, not total darkness, but something denser than shadow. I left the soup untouched and walked into the hallway to fetch the toolbox. But the hallway bulb, still unreplaced, was also dead. I stood there in the semi-darkness, listening. The house didn't creak. The refrigerator compressor wasn't humming. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and my own breath. I returned the soup to the stove and lit a candle, one of the emergency ones from the cupboard. Its flame jumped sharply, casting harsh, flickering shadows along the kitchen tiles. They moved too quickly. Or perhaps I was simply too still. Later that evening, I replaced the dining room bulb. It worked for a few minutes, then dimmed again. I tried another. Same result. When I checked the bulbs themselves, they weren't burned out. They were fine. The house simply refused to illuminate fully. I thought of the mold, of its slow invasion, of how it crept along ducts and wire paths, unseen. Mold doesn't just stay in corners. It travels. It finds warmth, moisture, darkness. The electrical system might have become part of its network, literal or metaphorical. I had read studies once about the way spores interact with materials, corroding copper, interfering with plastic insulation, displacing heat. But it wasn't just science that unnerved me now. It was sensation. Every room felt a little dimmer than it had the day before. I began lighting candles more frequently, not out of necessity, but to counter the growing sense of vanishing light. The bulbs were functional. The fixtures were fine. But the light itself had changed. It no longer felt warm. It no longer comforted. It revealed less and left more to shadow. One morning, I woke before sunrise and walked through the house in slippers, holding a flashlight. The beam bounced along the walls, illuminating patches of dust and fingerprints. I pointed it toward the basement door and hesitated. I hadn't been down there in weeks. The steps groaned as I descended, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The basement was worse than I remembered. Damp, dark, and close. The air was thick with a smell I hadn't fully registered before. Not rot, not mildew, something in between. A scent that clung to the back of the tongue, made worse by the silence of the space. I moved toward the breaker panel and flipped it open. The switches were all in place. I touched each one, dry, cold. But I saw something then, just a flicker of movement, along the ceiling near the insulation. I raised the flashlight and spotted it. A patch of black growth, spreading in a chaotic pattern across the joists. Uneven, pulsing slightly in the breeze of the ductwork. The flashlight caught a glint of moisture on its surface. I stepped back. I knew what it was. I didn't need a microscope. My lungs reacted instantly. A shallow cough, followed by a sharp sting in the chest. I left the basement, closing the door behind me slowly, carefully, as though sealing off something sentient. That night, the bedroom light dimmed to the point of uselessness. I sat in the armchair near the window and watched the streetlights outside through a narrow gap in the curtain. They glowed steadily, untouched. The problem wasn't the grid. The problem was the house. I took to carrying the flashlight in my pocket during the day. I placed candles in every room, matches in every drawer. I set one by the bedside next to my water glass, and I began marking on a chart which lights failed, and when, noting their positions, durations, intensities. I tried replacing them with newer, brighter bulbs, even LED ones. Nothing changed. The light was being consumed, not physically, but functionally. The way water disappears into dry soil, absorbed. I called no one. I told no one. I wrote another letter. In it, I described the pattern of light loss. I included sketches, dates, symptoms. I described the growing sense of opacity, the way the air itself felt denser when the lights dimmed, the way the walls seemed to lean closer in lower illumination. I signed the letter with my full name and the time of day. Then I folded it and slipped it behind the bookshelf, between 2 volumes on electrical pathology. As I moved through the house the next day, I noticed even natural light had changed. It filtered through the curtains more weakly, as though the glass had thickened. Or perhaps the air itself had grown dense with particles, spores invisible to the eye, but heavy on the breath. The house was becoming something else. Not just old, not just sick. It was adapting. And light, once my ally, was the first casualty. So I waited. With flashlight in hand, letters in hiding, and a mind that no longer trusted what it saw. And each time a bulb dimmed or failed, I simply stood beneath it and listened to the silence it left behind. I knew it had to be quiet. No ceremony, no last straw, no confrontation. I wasn't looking for justice, not the kind that wears robes or slams gavels. I wanted evidence, the kind no one could talk their way out of, the kind that didn't just suggest, but confirmed. I had waited long enough. I had watched long enough. The lights dimmed. The walls whispered. My body told me something was wrong, and the house had only confirmed it. But what I didn't know yet, what I needed to know, was whether it was the house alone that had turned on me, or if someone else had helped it along. For days, I rehearsed the steps in my mind. I knew the way my daughter moved through the house, the places she touched, the rhythm of her visits. I watched the hallway when she passed through it. I timed her movements from kitchen to living room. I knew she always asked to help tidy up, and I knew she always opened the basement door under the pretense of checking the furnace, even when it wasn't cold. She had access. That wasn't a theory. That was fact. What I didn't have was proof of use. I needed to know if she'd done something, if she'd introduced something into this place I once called mine. So I set the stage. I cleaned the house, not in a way that would attract attention, but in a way that left a neutral surface. No dust, no fingerprints. I placed small folded squares of tissue paper at the base of every vent, secured with a single tack. They were barely visible unless you knew to look. I positioned clear adhesive tape beneath 3 doorknobs, hall closet, attic stairs, and basement, carefully trimmed and pressed so that any disturbance would leave a smudge or tear. I placed an old thermometer in the corner of the dining room and snapped a photo of the needle. I took baseline photos of everything: the placement of chairs, the drawer of cleaning supplies, the spice rack. Then I invited her over. I told her I was feeling worse, which wasn't a lie. I told her I might need help organizing medications, which was. She arrived late in the morning with a cloth bag full of what she claimed were supplements and pre-cut fruit containers. Her smile was warm, but thin. She moved through the house like she owned it, not in arrogance, but in assumption. I let her. I told her I needed to lie down. I said the light was bothering my eyes. She told me to rest. She would take care of things. I nodded and went to the bedroom. I didn't lie down. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I heard the sound of cabinets opening. The sink ran briefly, then silence. A drawer, the fridge, a door creaking, too heavy to be the pantry. Basement. I stepped out of the bedroom in socks, soft on the floor. I moved slowly, avoiding every creak I knew by heart. I stopped near the edge of the hallway, just where the corner met the stairwell. I waited in silence, and then I heard it. A canister hiss, a faint aerosol release, not cooking spray, not air freshener. I recognized the sound. It was controlled, short, and purposeful. Another hiss followed, then a rustle, a bag being shaken out, a series of steps, then nothing. She came back up not long after. Her hairline was damp. She had changed her shirt. She smiled as she passed me in the hallway and said the basement smelled musty. I should consider airing it out. I smiled and nodded. That evening, after she left, I walked through the house with my camera and my gloves. I examined the tape on the basement doorknob. A clear fingerprint had smudged the center. One of the tissue squares in the air vent behind the couch had been disturbed, the tack half loose, the paper hanging sideways. I opened the cabinet under the sink and found one of the cleaner bottles was half empty, though I had marked it with a line just the night before. A chemical I hadn't purchased. The label was new. It wasn't enough. So I used the one thing I knew she wouldn't see. The camera. It wasn't a new model, just an old motion-activated unit I had once used to monitor raccoons in the attic. I cleaned it, tested the batteries, and placed it inside a stack of books on the shelf beside the living room air vent. The spine of the books had been cut to conceal the lens. It faced the hallway, clear view of the basement door, the central vent, and the space beside the thermostat where she liked to pause and look around. I angled the lens just slightly upward. I tested it 4 times. It worked. The next visit came 3 days later. She brought soup. She stayed longer than usual. At one point, I heard the basement door open and close again. I heard her cough. I pretended to sleep. When she left, I waited. I gave it 2 hours. I didn't want to seem eager, not even to myself. Then I retrieved the camera. The footage was clear. She entered the hallway and looked around. She wore gloves, thin latex ones, the kind medical professionals use. She opened her bag and took out a spray bottle. She knelt by the vent. She sprayed once, waited, sprayed again. She moved quickly. She opened the basement door, looked behind her, and descended. The camera didn't catch what she did down there, but she was gone for 13 minutes. When she returned, she removed the gloves and wiped the door handle with a cloth. I watched the footage 3 times. Each time, my hands steadied more. Not shaking, not angry, just sure. I copied the footage onto 3 USB drives. One went into the old evidence envelope I had used in court once, still marked with chain of custody labels. The second went into the hollow VHS cassette, labeled Tax Records 2003. The third I mailed the next morning, addressed to Dr. Edward Zimmer at the pathology department. I included a note. Secure, possible contamination event. More to follow. For the first time in weeks, I slept without waking. The house was still dim. The cough remained. The walls still whispered. But I had what I needed. Not just facts, not just suspicion. I had the trump card, the moment that no one could refute, the moment I could lay on the table when the time came. And I would wait. Wait for the next move. Not because I was afraid, because now I was prepared. It started with the water, not the taste, though that had changed too, but the temperature. No matter how long I let the faucet run, it remained lukewarm, tepid, as though the hot line had been interrupted. I checked the heater. The pilot was on. The pressure gauge steady. I even traced the pipework in the basement, feeling each segment with the back of my hand, waiting for heat that never came. It was like the warmth had vanished into the walls. I boiled water for tea that afternoon and watched as the bubbles failed to reach a full roll. I tried again. Still no proper boil. I replaced the kettle, then the burner, though both had worked the day before. Something in the energy of the house was changing, slowing, weakening, hesitating before it gave me what I asked of it. It felt like the structure itself was resisting, but my mind, that was clearer, sharper than it had been in weeks. Since hiding the camera, since securing the copies, since mailing the footage, something in me had begun to settle. Not with relief, not with peace, but with focus. My hands steadied. My thoughts aligned. The hallucinations they'd tried to suggest, the mental fatigue they'd ascribed to age, all of it began to unravel under the weight of reality. And yet, the symptoms persisted. I coughed less, yes, but only when I stayed in certain parts of the house. The attic remained tolerable, the bedroom less so, the kitchen worst of all. The living room had a strange duality. Mornings were manageable, but by evening, it became unbearable. I suspected it had something to do with airflow. The HVAC system was ancient, and I no longer trusted it. I'd shut off the central system entirely by then. I kept windows open during the day, even in cold weather, and sealed them again at dusk. I logged my symptoms like I had done in the lab. Time, intensity, location, and patterns emerged. I began to suspect the manipulation wasn't continuous. It came in pulses, cycles, perhaps dosage. The cough grew stronger after her visits. My disorientation spiked the mornings after. I noted the days when she lingered near the vents, when she rearranged items in the kitchen or returned from the basement flushed and breathing harder than the stairs alone could justify. On those days, I always felt worse the next morning. I switched my food entirely. I stopped eating what she brought. No more light soups or sliced fruit. I consumed only canned goods I opened myself, dated years back. Dry toast, boiled oats. I sterilized utensils before use, boiled water in an electric kettle I kept in the bedroom. I brushed my teeth with bottled water. I cooked with vinegar. I kept logs. My body began to respond, not with miraculous health, but with resistance. The headaches eased. My heart stopped racing. My tongue lost its strange bitterness, which meant only one thing. The symptoms were not mine. They were introduced, induced, imposed. The body doesn't lie. That was a rule I had learned early. In pathology, in chemistry, in autopsy. It was never the testimony of the living that revealed truth. It was the silent data of flesh, blood, lung, and liver. And my body, though aging, still spoke with clarity. What it said now was simple. When I controlled the environment, the symptoms faded. When she intervened, they returned. One morning, I woke with a nosebleed. Not severe, but sudden. A slow, dark trail across the pillow. I documented it, logged it, bagged the tissue. The next morning it happened again, this time with a headache, a sharp, focused pain behind my left eye. I hadn't left the bedroom in over 12 hours. Nothing had changed in the room, except the vent. I had sealed most vents with plastic sheeting and tape, but the one in the bedroom had a small tear near the edge, no larger than a fingernail. I examined it with a flashlight. There were smears along the plastic, not dust, not water, something oily. I cut a sample and sealed it. The next day, I removed the grate from the wall and shined my light deep inside. The interior was coated in a film, not thick, but present. It shimmered slightly. I scraped it into a glass jar, sealed it, and labeled it Master Bedroom Vent, 3:42 p.m. I had no lab to test it now, no microscope. but I knew what I was looking at. The residue was consistent with dispersant agents. I had seen it before, in industrial accidents, in pest control violations, in malpractice cases involving environmental tampering, the kind of compound used to suspend toxic particulates in the air. It didn't prove intent, but it proved action. She came again that week, smiling, her hair neatly pulled back, her bag larger than usual. She brought herbal tea. I didn't drink it. She offered to clean. I declined. She offered to replace some of the bulbs. I told her I liked the dimness. She lingered in the hallway longer than necessary. She stepped into the kitchen and pulled the trash, though it was only half full. I watched her hands. Thin gloves, same as last time. She wiped down the counter with a cloth she claimed she'd brought from home. "More absorbent," she said. I nodded. Let her talk. Let her work. That night, I reviewed the footage. I had placed a second camera behind the paneling in the hall closet, angled downward toward the vent and light switch. It caught her clearly, removing the vent cover, spraying something inside, replacing it, wiping fingerprints, then adjusting the thermostat, not to a temperature, but to a cycle, a timed release. She was efficient, practiced, not her first time. I felt nothing when I watched it. No rage, no grief, just confirmation. The symptoms were no longer mine. They were hers, introduced through behavior, carried out in secret, documented in silence, and now, catalogued. I printed stills from the footage. I sealed them with notes. I made copies of everything and placed them in separate envelopes, one under the floorboard beside the bed, one taped beneath the dining room table, one in the crawlspace behind the water heater. Redundancy. Always. I stopped responding to her texts. I watched as she tried to schedule more visits, feigning concern, layering her words with soft control. I let the messages accumulate. I replied once, briefly, "Feeling better. Resting more. Will call soon." She didn't push, and that silence, too, was a symptom. They always reveal themselves eventually, not through their words, but through the adjustments they make when plans go awry. Her silences grew longer, her care less insistent, and the house under my control once more grew stiller. The symptoms had told the truth. The body never lies, but people do, and sometimes so convincingly they forget the truth lives on, in mucus and blood and breath and gray particles that settle silently in the corners. All I had to do now was wait, not for proof, but for the moment she realized I had stopped playing sick. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that hangs in the air with nothing in it, no appointments, no weather, no interruptions. I hadn't planned to go into the guest room. I rarely did. It had remained largely untouched since my wife's final year, preserved more out of inertia than nostalgia. But I had noticed a faint draft seeping under the door that morning, the kind of cool breath that didn't belong to heating systems or cracked windows, a draft with direction, with intent. I opened the door slowly and stepped into the stillness. The curtains were drawn tight, casting the room in a soft gray hue. Dust motes hovered mid-air like suspended decisions. I stood for a moment, listening. No creaks, no hums, just the flat quiet of an unused space. The bed was still made, the corners tucked sharp as she used to do. The closet door was ajar. That was the first detail. I never left it that way. I crossed the room and opened the closet fully. Inside, my wife's coats still hung neatly, though most had not been worn in years. Underneath them, boxes were stacked. Holiday decorations, old photo albums, tax files going back longer than the IRS probably cared to remember. But what caught my attention was the new addition. A small plastic storage container, clear, with a blue lid. The kind you buy in bulk from hardware stores, the kind you don't inherit. I crouched down and pulled it forward. It was lighter than I expected. Inside were papers, folders, envelopes, receipts, all neatly ordered. clearly placed with care, not the chaotic stuffing of things hurriedly hidden. This was intentional, curated. I lifted the first folder. It was labeled in her handwriting, only it wasn't. At first glance, it mimicked her loops and curves, the way she wrote capital G like a figure 8. But the pressure was off. The ink was wrong. The stroke slightly too deliberate. I knew the difference the way a forger knows their own tremble. Inside the folder was paperwork for an insurance policy. My name listed clearly as the insured, but the beneficiary, my daughter. I scanned the document, noting the details. Life coverage, accidental death rider, a clause for long-term care compensation. Effective date, 6 months ago. Signature line, mine. But I had never seen this paper before. I looked closer at the signature. It wasn't traced. It was replicated. Lifted from a previous document, likely photocopied, then overlaid with enough pressure to imitate original ink. I had signed thousands of documents in my life. Wills, lab reports, affidavits. My hand knew its own language. This wasn't mine. Beneath the policy was a bank statement, a joint account I had never opened, with deposits matching the exact amount of my monthly pension. Withdrawals followed a pattern: grocery stores, gas stations, medical supply outlets, all in her town, all under her name. I flipped to the final page and saw something else. A charge for home renovation supplies, piping, sealant, ventilation tools, dated 2 weeks before the symptoms in the house had started. Another folder revealed printed emails, conversations with an insurance broker, exchanges about adjusting the payout schedule for end-of-life circumstances, language that danced around legality, emails that hinted but never stated. I read through them slowly, line by line. Some were signed with her initials, others simply with "sent from my iPhone." The container also held photographs, not family ones, surveillance stills, of me. Blurry images taken from across the street, through the windows. One showed me reading in the armchair, another standing in the yard with a rake. A third, taken through the back window, captured me asleep at the kitchen table, head resting against my forearm. I stared at that one the longest. Then came the notebook, a plain black spiral-bound pad, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. Inside were handwritten notes, brief, coded, clinical. Increase ventilation exposure, day 3. Reduce water access next week. Leave vitamins, observe compliance. Lethargy consistent, language still intact, no visible aggression. A different pen had written the final entry. Prepare for phase-out. Schedule visit with attorney next month. I felt my mouth go dry. Not in fear, not in panic, but in understanding. The pieces snapped together not like a puzzle, but like a trap. She had laid it carefully, slowly, not out of rage, not from malice, but from calculation. She had medical knowledge, legal access, emotional proximity. She had everything she needed, and she had used it. I stood up, knees crackling beneath me, and carried the container to the desk in the corner. I laid everything out in a precise grid, just as I had with evidence in the early days of my career. I photographed each item with my phone. I backed up the images. I transferred them to a secure drive. Then I made copies. One set went into an envelope I marked Duplicate A. I placed it inside a hollow in the old radiator behind the living room chair. Another went under the loose floorboard in the hallway, the one I had never repaired because it reminded me of her footsteps. The third I mailed the following morning to Edward Zimmer, along with a note. Supplemental material. Matches previous submission. Escalate to legal if necessary. That evening, I sat in the dark and watched the light fade from the hallway again. One bulb flickered, then died. I didn't move to change it. I didn't reach for the flashlight. I let the house dim itself around me, the way a body dims before death. But I wasn't dying. I was documenting. The final discovery hadn't been the insurance, or the email, or even the surveillance. It was the shift in my own mind, the understanding that love, when twisted by self-interest, no longer behaves like love at all. It mimics care. It speaks in soothing tones. It holds your hand with one glove on. But beneath that glove is a pen, and the signature on your death certificate, in your own handwriting. It did not come like thunder. It did not break the sky or rattle the walls. Retribution came softly, as I always believed it should. Quiet, measured, precise. Not revenge, not rage, only restoration, of balance, of dignity, of truth. It began with the envelope. I had taken my time assembling it. Not hurried, not impulsive. It was thick by the time I sealed it, nearly straining at the corners. Inside were photocopies of every insurance document, every fraudulent form with my forged signature, every bank statement showing a trail of stolen income, every email exchange between her and the broker, annotated line by line in my own hand. I included stills from the footage, her face visible, the gloves, the spray bottle, the vent. I added excerpts from my symptom journal and a brief summary of my qualifications, in case someone felt tempted to assume I was senile. I addressed it to the Medical Board of Ethics, using a courier service that required a signature upon delivery. I added a second envelope for the State Department of Health, a third for the Office of Elder Affairs, a fourth for the Board of Trustees at the hospital where she still practiced. I signed each one with full name, title, and license number, even though it had long expired. The credentials mattered. The truth mattered more. The copies I mailed were only the first strike. I also left one envelope with Edward Zimmer, who had called after receiving the footage weeks earlier. His voice had been grave, but steady. He knew something was wrong. He didn't ask questions. He offered names, contacts, people who still remembered my testimony, my reputation, my integrity. The wheels began turning faster than I expected. Within 3 days, I received a call from an investigator assigned to elder abuse cases. His tone was cautious at first, until he realized I wasn't simply claiming suspicion. I was providing a dossier. He asked for permission to forward my evidence to the local police. I agreed. He asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint against my daughter. I said no. I had already filed the truth. What the law did with it now wasn't my concern. Later that afternoon, I received a letter from the Department of Insurance. They were opening an inquiry into the life policy she had taken out. A fraud specialist would be in contact. I nodded as I read it. Slowly. Alone in the kitchen where she had once wiped my counter as though cleaning a child's mess. I didn't call her. She arrived on her own. It was a Thursday morning when her car pulled into the driveway, slower than usual. She didn't bring a bag this time. No soup, no vitamins, just herself. Her posture had changed, shoulders hunched, steps slower. She came to the door and knocked, a detail I found strangely meaningful. For the first time in months, she didn't use her key. I answered, stepping aside without a word. She entered, looked around, then turned to face me. Her expression was a mixture of worry, guilt, and something else, uncertainty perhaps, as though she were trying to calculate how much I knew and how much she could still control. I gestured to the living room, where 3 identical brown envelopes sat on the table, one addressed to her directly. I watched her eyes land on the others, recognizing the official seals, the institutional logos, the weight of paper. Her hand hovered over the one with her name. She didn't open it. She asked something. I no longer remember what. Maybe it was why, or how, or if I understood what this meant for her career, her family, her future. I didn't answer. I simply stood still, arms at my sides, and let the silence thicken around us. She left soon after. She didn't slam the door. The following week, a letter came from the hospital's ethics board. She had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. I read it slowly, then folded it and placed it in the same drawer where I had once hidden her first forged policy. The drawer was no longer a place of fear. It had become a record, a vault. That same day, I received confirmation from the financial institution that the fraudulent account had been frozen. The representative I spoke to used the word identity theft without hesitation. They apologized. I did not. More letters arrived. More calls. There were requests for statements, for sworn affidavits, for copies of the original footage. I complied with everything, methodically. I asked no questions. I gave no speeches. I didn't dramatize or inflate. I let the facts carry themselves, the way I always had in courtrooms and labs. Evidence does not scream. It waits. Weeks passed. The air in the house changed, not just metaphorically, physically. The smell lessened. The cough diminished. The humidity dropped. I tested the air with a home mold kit. Nothing registered. The residue that had once clung to the vents vanished. The light bulbs, previously dim and erratic, held steady. My body stopped waking at night with confusion. My fingers no longer trembled. I had the ducts professionally cleaned. I replaced the filters. I repainted the baseboards. I opened the windows each morning, not for survival, but for ritual. The house no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a room I had unlocked. I watched her name slowly vanish from the online staff directory, first with a suspended notice, then with nothing at all. I never saw her on the street again. She didn't call. She didn't write. But I knew from whispers in town, from old colleagues who still exchanged emails, that her license had been reviewed and flagged, that malpractice attorneys had begun to circle, that insurance audits were underway. I didn't rejoice. I didn't even smile. Retribution is not about celebration. It's about balance. It's about the quiet correction of an imbalance so deep, so intimate, it doesn't make noise when it breaks. It only settles into place. I spent my evenings reading again, books I had neglected, notes I had written decades ago. I dusted off my old journals, not to revisit pain, but to remember who I had been before the silence took root. I planted small herbs on the windowsill, rosemary, thyme, mint. I began making my own tea. I no longer accepted gifts. I bought a new lock for the door, not out of fear, out of principle. And when I sat in the armchair that had once faced the hallway like a sentry, I no longer watched the shadows or listened for footsteps. I let the silence fill the room, not with dread, but with restoration. Retribution didn't knock loudly. It arrived like a final breath after drowning, quiet, unmistakable, and entirely mine. The house no longer breathed. That was the first thing I noticed when I woke one morning and sat at the edge of my bed in the hush of early light. The usual creaks had stopped. The floorboards beneath my feet no longer groaned with temperature shifts or settled with quiet complaint. The air held still, unmoving, as if the entire structure had fallen into a deeper sleep than I could reach. Even the walls, once pulsing with damp, living tension, now felt inert, as though whatever had inhabited them had exhaled one final time, and never drawn breath again. I stood slowly and crossed the hallway. The wallpaper, once warping at the corners, hung flat and silent. The light bulb overhead hummed faintly but steadily. No flicker, no dim. I placed my hand along the trim beneath the window and felt dry wood, warm from the rising sun. No residue, no film, no faint trace of oil. Just age, just material. Nothing alive. In the kitchen, the difference was more pronounced. The scent had changed. Where there had once been a thick chemical undercurrent, barely perceptible but heavy, there was now only the clean neutrality of dust and soap and thyme. I inhaled through my nose, expecting the familiar catch in my throat, the dry itch that had defined so many mornings. but there was nothing. Just breath. Clear and full. I boiled water. It reached a true rolling boil in less than 4 minutes. I poured it over a spoonful of loose mint leaves, fresh from the plant I kept in the windowsill. The steam rose and curled toward the ceiling, unimpeded, unstained. I sat at the table and wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling its warmth travel slowly up my arms, a kind of quiet reassurance. I didn't drink it right away. I just held it, listening to the house. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. Each room had shed something. The master bedroom no longer carried the scent of stale sweat and medication. The guest room, once thick with memory and manipulation, now stood still and formal, as if it had returned to its intended purpose, a space for pause, not deception. The hallway, which had narrowed over the months, metaphorically, perceptibly, felt wide again, not physically, but in air, in freedom. I walked through each room slowly, like a curator assessing an exhibit long closed for restoration. I touched corners. I checked the vents. I lifted cushions and examined baseboards. No new stains. No mold. No movement. The house had entered a state of remission, not just from disease, but from intrusion. I entered the basement last. For a long time I had avoided it, not out of fear, but because I knew it held more than cold and pipes and dust. It had been the center of activity, the nerve under the skin where so much had been altered, infused, hidden. But now, as I opened the door and descended, the air that met me was cool and odorless. The concrete floor was dry. The walls no longer shimmered under the flashlight. I tested the vent system. I ran my fingers along the ducts. No residue. I even knelt and placed my palm flat against the floor, waiting for any tremor of pressure, of movement, of presence. There was none. I stood in the middle of the basement and listened. No hissing, no clinking, no hidden mechanisms springing into motion behind the walls. The silence had weight, but not menace. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, not the threat of another, the echo of survival. I went back upstairs and opened all the windows. It was unseasonably warm that day. A rare breeze swept in from the east, carrying with it the scent of drying leaves and distant soil. I watched the curtains lift gently, rhythmically, not in warning, but in welcome. The house wasn't resisting anymore. It was breathing again, not artificially, not through vents laced with chemicals. It was breathing on its own, naturally, fully. And I no longer coughed. I stood at the threshold of the living room and let the air move around me. My shoulders, long tensed, dropped an inch. My chest, often tight, loosened without conscious effort. My thoughts, usually spiraling, slowed to match the tempo of the light filtering across the floorboards. There was nothing urgent now, nothing hidden. The mail came around noon. I heard the rustle of the box, the quiet departure of the postal truck. Among the usual envelopes was a letter from the Department of Health. It confirmed that the investigation had concluded. The evidence was sufficient. The findings had been substantiated. A full report would be mailed separately. I set it aside. There was nothing in it that could change what I already knew. I began cleaning, not from fear or obsession, but as ritual. I dusted surfaces, laundered curtains, swept floors. I didn't scrub or disinfect. I moved slowly, intentionally, making the space mine again. I opened drawers and threw out expired medicine, old notes, dead batteries. I cleared shelves of trinkets that no longer held stories I wanted to keep. The house was still old, but it no longer felt haunted by manipulation. In the bedroom, I changed the sheets and flipped the mattress. I placed a clean glass of water on the nightstand without checking it in the morning. In the hallway, I replaced the bulb I had deliberately left dark for weeks. It glowed steady and warm, casting soft light across the walls. I looked at the framed photographs still hanging there, of my wife, my younger self, even my daughter when she was a child. I did not remove them. They no longer frightened me. That evening, I stood outside just before sunset and watched the last light stretch across the front yard. The shadows were long, but not sharp. The air was cool, but not bitter. Behind me, the house stood still, windows open, curtains breathing gently, floors steady. It was not triumphant. It was simply whole. I went inside and locked the door, not out of habit, not out of caution, but as punctuation. This chapter was closed. The structure had been rewritten, the pressure lifted, and for the first time in months, I slept without interruption. No dreams, no fear, just silence. A house that no longer breathed with danger, but simply rested beside me. Quiet, unmoving. Mine again. I no longer woke with urgency. For months, my mornings had begun with a jolt, chest tight, eyes scanning the ceiling for shadows that didn't move. But now I woke slowly, quietly, with the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from dread, but from deep, uninterrupted sleep. There was no sound, save for the distant rhythm of birds in the branches beyond the window. The house remained still. The light that filtered through the curtains had softened with the season, paler now, less assertive. I sat up in bed and let it wash over me. The air smelled clean, not sterile, not lemon-scented or filtered, just clean. No trace of mildew, no chemical aftertaste at the back of the throat. Just wood, cotton, distant rain in the soil. I ran my palm along the blanket, feeling its worn texture beneath my fingers, and sat for a while without thought. No plans, no tension. The day waited, but it didn't press. I made my way to the kitchen without slippers. The floor was cold, but the sensation grounded me. I boiled water, sliced bread, and stood by the window as the kettle hissed. The herb pots on the sill had grown fuller, mint, basil, a small pot of thyme that now curled outward like it had finally decided to thrive. The kettle clicked off, and I poured the water over loose leaves, letting the steam curl around my wrist as it rose. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open the mail. Those things had lost their urgency. I no longer tracked symptoms. I no longer made copies or moved silently through the house like a shadow documenting crime scenes. I still remembered everything, but the memory had settled into its proper place, behind me. Not forgotten, but filed. The way you remember a storm without needing to relive the sound of every broken branch. I sat at the kitchen table and sipped the tea slowly. The chair no longer creaked. The table no longer felt too large. I read the morning light like a letter, folded across the surface, drifting slightly with the movement of the sun. Nothing extraordinary happened. No revelations, no sharp emotion, just warmth where cold had lived. By late morning, I found myself tending to small things, tightening a loose hinge, replacing the batteries in the smoke detector. I didn't do it out of need, but from instinct. Order had always been my language, and I finally had the quiet to speak it again. I swept the porch, wiped the windows, and trimmed the ivy along the gate. My hands, though slower than they once were, remembered the work. The motion was enough. The results were secondary. Neighbors passed occasionally. They waved. I waved back. No one asked questions. Whatever rumors had rippled through town had long since lost their sharpness. The silence of the scandal had been louder than its noise, and in time it, too, had faded. I was just the old man on the corner again, the one with the steady steps and unreadable eyes. In the afternoons, I read. Books I had once started and abandoned, not out of disinterest, but from the inability to focus. Now I could. The words stayed. The sentences meant something. I reread passages I'd once underlined and no longer remembered why. I laughed at how different they felt now, how much they revealed that I hadn't understood at the time. I kept a notebook beside me, not to track evidence, but to record reflections, quiet thoughts, lines that made me pause. I filled pages slowly. There was no rush. Evenings came gently. No more sudden darkness. No more flickering bulbs or power that faltered. The light stayed steady. I moved from room to room, turning them on deliberately, not out of necessity, but to inhabit the space. I opened the windows slightly, letting in the evening air. It carried no warnings, no bitterness, just the soft chill of autumn returning. Dinner became a ritual, nothing elaborate. A baked potato, a boiled egg, sometimes just toast and butter with a small glass of wine. I set the table each night, even though I sat alone. One plate, one napkin, one fork, a candle lit in the center. The quiet was not loneliness anymore. It was mine. I often walked through the house before bed, not to inspect, not to check locks or listen at walls, just to be present, to feel the place that had nearly been taken from me settle into itself again. The air no longer fought me. The silence no longer accused. Each room carried a new kind of weight, earned, calm, unspoken. I paused often in the guest room, though I hadn't changed anything. I didn't strip it or rearrange the furniture. I left it as it was, a preserved frame around a painting that had been painted over. The energy inside had shifted, the threat gone, only history remained. And I let it remain. I didn't need to erase it to be free from it. At night, I returned to my room and lay in bed without assistance, without medication. I no longer propped myself with extra pillows or monitored my breath. The darkness no longer pressed against me. It wrapped itself around me like a quiet coat. I slept deeply, without dreams. In that sleep, there was no fear of not waking. And when I did wake, each morning was its own reward, not dramatic, not triumphant, but full. The world hadn't changed, only the weight I carried within it. Peace had not arrived as a gift. It had been excavated, inch by inch, from beneath months of damp lies and quiet cruelty. It had cost me more than I expected, but it belonged to me now, fully, and I held it not like a prize, but like a steady breath drawn in silence.